Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for joining me as we present our first webinar of 2022. Our focus today is thyroid health, and you may ask, why are we spending time on that particular disease? 20 million Americans have thyroid disease, which is about 12% of our population, and 60% of those are undiagnosed. Various symptoms that appear vague are often related to thyroid disease: hair loss, depression, anxiety, GI concerns, menstrual irregularities. And if gone untreated, thyroid disease can cause cardiovascular disease, osteoporosis, and infertility. From the ethnic perspective, if one has hypothyroidism and is African American, they have an increased risk of death, especially with congestive heart failure. And if hyperthyroidism, they are more likely to develop Graves' disease. So that is why we are talking about thyroid disease today. Again, my name is Yvonne Collins, and I welcome you to the Delta Research and Educational Foundation Research Matters for All of Us webinar. You can see on the screen our Leadership Council, which has worked diligently to ensure that we fulfill our requirement to the National Institute of Health to educating the population on various health diseases with the ultimate goal of increasing accrual to the All of Us research program. NIH chose these 12 wonderful cities, and each month, each city puts on 2 webinars very similar to this with the same topics to get the word out. Our job ultimately is to educate the African American community and increase accrual to clinical trials. The Delta Research and Educational Foundation was established in 1967 as a nonprofit organization with the sole goal of supporting African American women and their families. The campaign objectives, as I stated earlier, are to increase awareness around diseases, with our focus today, thyroid, encourage health and wellness overall, with a focus on the African American community. We are one of 5 groups focusing on disproportionate minorities, that is African American populations, Latinx populations, senior populations, just to name a few. Let's look at the work we've done thus far.
In 1967, Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated established the Delta Research and Educational Foundation as a public charity supporting scholastic achievement, public service programs, and research initiatives focused upon African American women and their families. Today, DREF remains strong, vibrant, and poised to meet 21st century challenges with the same unwavering spirit and dedication the sorority originally envisioned. The charge to realize social and economic equality for future generations of African American women continues as the guiding principle. Since 2017, DREF has received funding from the National Institutes of Health to continue its role as a national community engagement partner to promote the All of Us research program through a community awareness campaign that informs African Americans and minorities about the importance of understanding and participating in biomedical research. The National Health Initiative, conducted by the Delta Research and Educational Foundation in collaboration with Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated and the National Council of Negro Women, is entitled Research Matters: Creating Possibilities to Achieve Health and Wellness for All of Us. The objectives are to engage, educate, and ultimately enroll African Americans in the National Institutes of Health All of Us 1 in a Million campaign, a national database primarily comprised of diverse and traditionally underrepresented populations. The mission of the All of Us research program is simple. It is to speed up health research and medical breakthroughs by asking 1 million people to lead the way to provide the types of information that can help create individualized prevention, treatment, and care for all of us. The All of Us research program is a part of the Precision Medicine Initiative created during President Obama's administration. Precision medicine is healthcare that is based on you as an individual. It takes into account factors like where you live, what you do, and your family health history. Precision medicine's goal is to be able to tell people the best ways to stay healthy. If someone does get sick, precision medicine may help healthcare teams find the treatment that will work best. This will help give healthcare providers the information they need to make tailored recommendations relevant to people of different backgrounds, ages, or geographic regions. African Americans continue to have some of the highest incidence, prevalence, and mortality rates from chronic diseases such as cardiovascular disease, diabetes, obesity, hypertension, mental health, and HIV/AIDS. Yet we comprise only 5% of clinical trials participants in America. Our focus and objective is to create awareness about how research matters in closing the health disparities gap. DREF seeks the assistance of national organizations, local chapters, sections, community leaders, and organizations to make the All of Us research program a successful endeavor. The influence, leadership, and participation of the aforementioned groups are needed to assist in promoting this groundbreaking opportunity. Individuals, groups, and organizations are welcome to assist with conducting and/or identifying outreach activities. Training, materials, and monetary resources may be available to support groups and organizations with approved collaborations. Please send an email of interest to researchmatters@deltafoundation.net outlining upcoming activities and events in which the All of Us research program can be included. For more information, please visit www.joinallofus.org/DREF.
So as I stated earlier, since September of 2020, given what we all know about the pandemic, all of our events have been virtual, but we have been diligent in each and every month for the 12 cities providing their 2 monthly webinars. So what is the NIH All of Us research program? Well, it's a 5-year longitudinal study that really is historic, with the ultimate gain of gathering 1 million diverse groups of participants to help move research along. And we saw that with the COVID vaccine. Let's look at
So
this
tonight
video
I'm
on
launching
precision
a new
medicine.
precision medicine initiative to bring us closer to curing diseases like cancer and diabetes, and to give all of us access to the personalized information we need to keep ourselves and our families healthier.
My name is Janelle Johnson. I'm a biologist in the Laboratory of Neurogenetics for the National Institute on Aging within the National Institutes of Health.
Dr. Janelle Johnson has long had an interest in neuroscience, especially in neurodegenerative diseases.
My focus is on the genetics of neuromuscular diseases, in particular ALS, but I also study neurodegenerative diseases such as Alzheimer's and Parkinson's disease.
Developing treatments for these diseases, treatments that are geared to the individual person, is also one of Dr. Johnson's goals.
Research has advanced to the point where personalized medicine has become a reality. And when I say personalized medicine, I mean that specific traits that you might have are more easily targeted by particular drugs. As researchers, we can target those drugs and find the best possible solutions for your diseases.
To find these solutions, scientists need to conduct clinical trials, research studies with volunteers, to see which treatments are safe and effective, and for whom.
If African Americans participate in research studies, they have the opportunity to treat or ultimately cure diseases. If not, we won't be sure if the current studies will apply to them.
Dr. Johnson says that more African Americans are needed for these studies, but there is sometimes reluctance to participate in clinical trials.
African Americans are often fearful of participating in clinical trials, and I think this largely has to do with the Tuskegee syphilis study, which lasted for about 40 years, so a lot of people were impacted by that.
However, today protections are in place that make participating in a study a very safe experience.
I think that African Americans can take time to educate themselves and others about the clinical trials that exist and the informed consent process.
So we've seen from the last 2 videos that precision medicine is now the new way. I'm an oncologist, and I remember at the beginning of my career, really every patient got the same drug. Now we're able to take tumors or take patients' blood and do genetic profiling on the blood or the tumor. And really now there are medications that we can give to target very specific genes that that particular patient may have. So it is a radical shift. Precision medicine is the way that we're going to be able to take individual characteristics into account. So not only do we look at your family history and your genetic makeup and your environment and your biology, but we're even going one step further to potentially look at the genetic makeup of either you or your tumor to determine how we treat you. So pretty impressive in terms of how that's being done. As part of this campaign, we also partner with our local institutions, which are called healthcare provider organizations. I'd like to bring Nicole on, who's our partner from Northwestern, and thank her because she's been very diligent with working with us over the last year and a half. Nicole, turn it over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Collins, for doing that wonderful presentation. Well, I'm so happy that I can be here to join you today. We appreciate you guys taking the time out to learn more about the program. And so I will share some of the next steps that you can take for enrollment. We have a list of participant locations throughout. So let's see, if we go to the next slide, we'll have I'll be able to share a list of, yep, right there, have a list of participant locations throughout Illinois, what is known as the All of Us Research Program Illinois Precision Medicine Consortium, or IPMC. And if you don't receive care at one of the health provider organizations shown here, you can still choose any one of these locations to partner with. And on the next slide, we'll go into a little bit more about what participation entails, which is made up of both an online and in-person portion. Okay, great. So the simplest and fastest way to download, to start off, is to download the All of Us Research app on your phone, or you can also go to the website at joinallofus.org/Illinois. So both on the app and the website is where you'll create an account. Your account, also known as your participant portal, is a digital dashboard for the participant journey. Once you create an account, participants will be asked to consent immediately. The consent process is an interactive journey that explains the program and participant rights. This includes choosing if you'd like to share your electronic health records. EHRs are important because it gives the most complete record of a person's health. When researchers can study EHR information from many people, they can find patterns, and those patterns can help better understand health. Then you'll be asked to complete a series of surveys. Survey completion is what will provide researchers with an understanding of your life and environment, like how you exercise and what you eat. And surveys are an important part of staying connected with participants and hearing about the changes in life over time. The next, participants will be given a list of nearby sites which they can partner with. As I shared with you in the previous slide, what those locations are. After you select your desired location, you then have the opportunity to schedule an in-person visit. And this portion will take about 30 minutes and includes basic physical measurements and a biosample collection. If you agree to provide blood, we will analyze the DNA in the samples. DNA is an important source of information about health that researchers use, and you'll have the opportunity to, as a participant, to receive those DNA results. And it looks at information like ancestry traits and health-related information, such as if you have a higher risk for certain health conditions or how your body might react to certain medications. And then lastly, participants can share data from supported third-party devices such as Fitbit and Apple Health. Both serve as additional sources of data collection. And because the All of Us research program is a longitudinal study, there's a large value in receiving multiple data points for participants over time to have a full understanding of the various factors that make your health story. Because what may work for you may not always work for me. So if anyone has any further questions for me regarding how to join, or if you're interested in learning more about what participation entails, please feel free to contact us using any information that Dr. Collins has, or I will also put our information at Join All of Us here in the chat.
Thank you, Nicole. You can see here, these are all of the avenues that you have to gain different information about the research program. You can use your QR code scanner or your camera there to get information. You can go to www.joinallofus.org/DREF or researchmatters@deltafoundation.net. Also, please feel free to view, like, and share all of our social media platforms. And of course, you can always reach out to me. Again, Yvonne Collins, your Chicago Citywide Coordinator. Before I bring on our featured guest for the morning, I must read you this disclaimer. The views and opinions expressed by the guest panelists and or presenters do not reflect the views or opinions of the Delta Research and Educational Foundation, DREF. DREF Research Matters for All of Us, the NIH All of Us Research Program, or any of its affiliates. Again, thank you very much for joining us today. I'd like to present this morning Dr. Pitts, who is an attending endocrinologist at Northwestern Medicine. I'm absolutely delighted he could join us today, and I think it will be a treat for all of you. He's a graduate of Talladega College, Harvard University, and did all of his training, internship, residency, and fellowship at Northwestern University. He has multiple publications, lectures, and appointments, and I will highlight two. He was Physician of the Year in 2011 and Man of the Year in Medicine in 1998. And Dr. Pitts, I'll turn it over to you. And thank you all for joining. Feel free to place your questions in the chat. Dr. Pitts, you're on mute if you've started talking.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Is everyone able to hear me now?
Yes.
Great. Well, to our audience today, good morning or good afternoon, whatever time zone you're in. And I'd like to thank the organizers for giving me a chance to actually participate in what I think is an excellent program. I should mention off the top that I'm actually a volunteer in All of Us as well. And I have submitted my own information for the use of research data. As billed, I'm an endocrinologist in private practice on the campus of Northwestern. And also I have been serving as an endocrinologist at a community, or actually now county hospital on the south side of Chicago, Providence of Cook County, for more years than I wish to claim today. And so I've had an opportunity to see a large number of people with thyroid problems. And today's concept, or today's talk, I'm not going to end up using a PowerPoint. I originally was going to use slides, but I realized that this is really a conversation more than a standard lecture. And so I thought that that might be more useful, that I would just talk and we could work through chat. So I always tell my students that we're going to tell people what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about it, and then we're going to tell them what we talked about, so that there's some continuity, some chance for you to hold on to the things that I think at least are important for you to hold on to. So with that bit of introduction, let's go ahead and talk about the thyroid gland. So everyone, men and women, children, all have thyroid glands that sits at the base of the neck, just above the collarbones. It's about 15 to 20 to 25 grams, so it's fairly small in size, and smaller in the last 20 years than it had been in the 40 to 50 to plus years and before that. We'll get back to that in a bit. The thyroid gland serves a role in health. It is a production center, or factory, if you will, for the production of thyroid hormones, two in number. One we abbreviate as T4, a second one that we abbreviate as T3. And these hormones have the ability to enter the bloodstream and impact multiple organs of the body, with the principal role of controlling metabolic, or energy producing and energy using activities. Sometimes when I talk about the thyroid, I use the metaphor of a carburetor for a car, or a drum major for a marching band, to give you a sense of its importance and how it coordinates multiple tissues into a smooth, functioning, healthy person. The thyroid itself is controlled further by the brain, in a particular part of the brain called the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland actually has the responsibility of controlling multiple hormones in our body. In addition to thyroid, it controls growth, or growth hormone. It controls adrenal or stress-related hormones. It controls reproductive hormones. And it also has a role in nutrition and feeding an infant and controlling milk production for a young mother. So in health, it plays a substantial role. It helps us metabolize our fuel, which we would call food. It therefore reflects in metabolism of things like wakefulness, heat regulation, and heart rate. In a disease state, it can do a number of things. Diseases are recognized, or thyroid diseases are recognized by, as mentioned by Dr. Collins, too much hormone production, which we would call hyper or overproduction, too little hormone, and we would call that underproduction or hypothyroidism. In addition to regulating the amount of hormones that are needed to correctly control the metabolism of the body, the thyroid can also grow large independent of hormone production. And as it grows larger, getting much larger than the 15 to 20 grams we talked about, sometimes as much as 200 or 300 grams, you can imagine that that kind of growth could cause some crowding in the neck. And in fact, it leads to what we call compressive or squeezing symptoms and neighboring structures such as the trachea or windpipe or the esophagus and the swallowing mechanism, causing difficulties in swallowing. So that would be something we would call goiter. We'll come back to that. It also has the ability, like other organs, to grow tumors, most of which are benign or not cancerous, but there are also the opportunity to grow cancerous growths, or what we call thyroid cancer. Finally, the thyroid, like other tissues, can become inflamed and painful. Doctors would refer to this as an thyroiditis. This is often quite symptomatic in people who come to the doctor or present to an emergency room or their primary care physician, complain of very, very tender areas in the base of the neck. Sometimes the pain radiates away from the neck to the side of the head or even into the shoulder. And it's a very uncomfortable but not life-threatening circumstance. So today's lecture, or indeed more really a conversation, I hope to briefly go over the rather broad discussion, not so much about treatment, but more about just the kinds of illnesses that occur in thyroid and how we might think about them, how we might be more aware of them, and how we might be on the watch for them. So to begin with, we'll talk about the overactive or hyperthyroidism. As mentioned by Dr. Collins, this is an overproduction of thyroid hormones from the thyroid gland. The symptoms or things that people are aware of are something called a racing heart. We might use the word palpitations, a tendency to feel overheated or inappropriate sweating. There is a tendency to have a nervousness or jittery feeling. Some people report that their hands are shaking, either in the resting position or with movement. Some people also report difficulty with sleeping or insomnia. Sometimes that presents as difficulty starting sleep and more often difficulty staying asleep. Very commonly, people come in, particularly women, with a concern about excessive hair loss. And the hair loss is involving the entirety of the scalp as opposed to just the front, or the caput of the head, which we would call male pattern balding. This would be loss of hair over the entire scalp area. Another unique circumstance would be an effect on women during their reproductive years in either having menstrual periods become irregular, or in some cases, complete cessation or stoppage of the menstrual periods, even though they're not menopausal. And then finally, there's also a sense of generalized weakness, unable to perform the same tasks that you're usually able to do, or you're able to perform them, but they're much more difficult. And then again, this is associated with weight loss. And the weight loss is often quite dramatic. Generally, we're talking about people who are losing in excess of 10% of their usual body weight. So if you weighed 200 pounds, we'd be talking about an excess of 20 pounds. That would certainly catch your attention. Physical findings that physicians might see, or you might see yourself, would be very prominent eyes, where the actual globes of the eyes seem to be coming forward out of the eye sockets. The colloquialism used to be bug eyes. As these globes of the eyes extend out of their sockets, or at least further out, they're of course exposed to more of the environment, so they become red and quite irritated. And if they become very swollen, it interferes with their ability to move smoothly in coordination with the opposite eye. And that leads to double vision. And this can involve both eyes or either eye, often both eyes, but to not the same degree. Another thing that you might notice, and a physician would notice, would be a swelling of the neck at the base of the neck, again, just above the collarbones in the midline. At the doctor's office, the heart rate would often be excessive, clearly higher than usual, and oftentimes greater than 100 beats per minute. We would also be aware of weight loss, as I've mentioned. We would also note that the touch of the skin is quite moist, even in a cool room. And then I'd also like to mention that we also notice that if we are checking reflexes of tendons, these are quite brisk, and you would not notice that as a patient or just looking at yourself, but they may be amplified as well. Critically, hyperthyroidism or overactive thyroid can also impact other illnesses. So as Dr. Collins mentioned, if you have some heart problems or if you have hypertension, this could be greatly exaggerated or made worse by that. And as a particularly important aggravation would be pregnancy. And so women who are in the course of pregnancy who experience hyperthyroidism are at increased risk for premature delivery, or at increased risk for overload or overworking of the heart, eclampsia, which is an accelerated hypertension, and an emergency or failed pregnancy. In addition, sometimes if the hyperthyroidism is present early on, women will have a hard time actually becoming pregnant. This condition is easily confirmed by the measurement of simple blood tests performed in every laboratory in the US for the most part. They are measured something called the thyroxine level. We abbreviate that as T4. Something called triiodothyronine, which we abbreviate as T3. And then, as I mentioned earlier, we also measure something from the pituitary gland, which also has a direct impact on controlling thyroid hormone circulation. And that hormone is called, appropriately, thyroid stimulating hormone. We often abbreviate that as TSH. In most circumstances, a patient or person with these problems or findings will not have all of those circumstances. Or if they have these problems, they might be much milder and much less debilitating. It's therefore, for a timely diagnosis, it's useful for all of us to identify who's at greatest risk for this condition. Most cases or causes of an overactive thyroid or hyperthyroidism are related to something called Graves' disease, named by the surgeon who originally diagnosed it, not necessarily a prognosis. And this is what's called an autoimmune disease. Many of you are familiar with that term. This is a term in which our own bodies are making antibodies against our own tissues. There are a family of these conditions, which I'll mention in just a minute. So the point of this is that if you come from a family with autoimmune disease, or more precisely, hypothyroidism, then that means that your risk of developing hyperthyroidism is substantially higher than the general public. In the future, in terms of precision medicine, we are developing more and more laboratory tests that go beyond the actual measurement of thyroid hormone and TSH. We call these markers of disease, or gene markers in some cases, which may help us identify risk far before the conditions ever begin. Just to conclude on this concept of autoimmune disease, other common conditions that would tip you off to an increased risk would be diabetes, and in particular, type 1 diabetes. Many of you are familiar with that term. I often use the term of type 1 diabetes as that form of diabetes that requires insulin, usually at initial diagnosis as opposed to years later. It requires both insulin to be covered during the time when you're not eating and time when you're eating as well. In years gone by, we called it juvenile diabetes, but it shows up now in not only middle age, but advanced age adults as well. Another common condition would be called celiac disease. And this is a condition in which we lose the ability to metabolize certain foods or gluten-rich foods, and it results in weight loss and diarrhea. But the point of this discussion is that it's another marker for autoimmune disease. Another condition would be adrenal gland failure. That's a whole discussion in and of itself. I'm not going to spend more about that, but just to say if these are in your family, the risk is greater. The other side of this would be an underactive condition, or hypothyroidism. And this, of course, would be when the gland is making too little or not enough thyroid hormone. People would perhaps be aware of, again, hair loss, but this would be more hair breakage than hair loss. These individuals often note that their skin is significantly drier than usual, even when they're not living in the Midwest. Laugh, laugh. Hoarseness or huskiness of the voice for both men and women. Weight gain, constipation, cold intolerance, more so than usual, and fatigue. I should mention that all of these symptoms are not at all unique to thyroid disease. We sometimes call them constitutional. So if you have these symptoms, it does not nail or confirm the diagnosis, but it is a reason to have you further investigated. Physical findings might include a slow heart rate. It might require or might notice swelling of the eyelids as opposed to the eye globes or the eyes themselves. Dry skin, I've already mentioned. Tending to develop fluid retention or swollen ankles extending into the shins or lower legs. And like hyperthyroidism, hypothyroidism, or underactive thyroid status can also aggravate other conditions, especially again in pregnancy. There's now a great deal of information that women who are pregnant in the first trimester, if she does not have adequate thyroid hormone, can impact the growth and development of the developing baby, and in particular, the mental health of the baby, the ability of the baby to learn. And so we are now at great emphasis to have all women who are considering pregnancy to clearly determine the thyroid status before actually beginning to plan and undergo the process of becoming pregnant, so that we can correct those things and lead to a healthier outcome for mom and child. The diagnosis or suspicion is again confirmed by measuring these same blood tests, the T4, the T3, and the TSH. I've already mentioned that these symptoms are quite common and could be overlooked. And so once again, it's important to really figure out if you're at increased risk for hypothyroidism, again, especially for women considering pregnancy. The most common cause of hypothyroidism is also an autoimmune disease. This one is named after its original diagnoser or person who described it, It's referred to as Hashimoto's disease. Not necessary to remember that, but it is the point of it is it's again an autoimmune condition in which your body suddenly attacks itself and diminishes the thyroid gland's ability to make sufficient or enough thyroid hormone. It's important to say here that both the hyper and hypothyroidism can be quickly and inexpensively treated once diagnosed. So our real goal is just to be aware of those things and for our audience to calculate if you are at increased risk, as well as getting something called, I'd like to refer to as an annual well patient exam. We're doing okay. I'm going to speed on to goiter. In the early 1900s, the most common cause of goiter, and let me define goiter as an increased size of gland, but just a big thyroid gland. The most common cause at that time was iodine deficiency. And if you lived on the seacoast, particularly in the United States on the east or west coast, and you had a diet that had a significant amount of seafood or saltwater fish, then you got sufficient iodine. If on the other hand, you lived in the Midwest or even the far west, but not by a sea, then your iodine intake was much less, and your thyroid gland had to work much harder to be able to produce the thyroid hormone, as iodine is an important part of thyroid hormone, and glands were much bigger, more like 30 to 40 grams as opposed to about 15 to 20 grams, or in other words, about twice as large. Since the 1920s, iodine is in our salt. In all nations of the world, it has actually increased. All nations have put iodine in their water or in their food sources. So an iodine deficiency based on diet is very rare in these days, and it would have more to do with somebody's own digestive system. I should make a note here that it's also very important for women considering pregnancy to have prenatal vitamins, because the iodine need for that first trimester or first part of pregnancy is quite high and not sufficient by just the diet. You do need the prenatal vitamins to supplement the iodine. Now, beyond simple goiter, most thyroid glands in these days are enlarged because they have one or more nodules. Nodules are little lumps on the thyroid gland. They may be very small and really not observable or feelable at all, or they may be so large that your friends or your close ones notice them, or you may even find them yourself while looking in the mirror. Typically, they don't involve pain. They are not red or irritated, but they grow. The most common circumstance in the United States is something called multinodular goiter. This is particularly common in postmenopausal women. This is a thyroid gland that has 1, 2, 3, perhaps as many as 8 nodules. Typically, all of these nodules will get larger and larger, but very slowly. They do not increase the risk of cancer. They are benign nodules, but physicians have the goal of deciding which ones are and which ones are not. So in this case, the blood test, the thyroid hormones, T3 and T4 and TSH, will not give us the amount of information we need to know. And there's a new technology, or relatively new technology, called the ultrasound of the thyroid gland. All of you, I think, in our audience have had some experience or some knowledge of the ultrasound. This is a microphone generator that has waves across the surface of the skin, and it can use sound waves to determine the anatomy of an internal organ. In this case, since the thyroid gland sits just below the skin, it's an excellent tool to give us great definition of what the thyroid looks like, and in particular, what the thyroid nodules under investigation might look like. Well, this becomes important because we have now been able to characterize both individual and multiple nodules in terms of size, shape, dimension, echogenicity, and this would mean whether it was a solid nodule or if it was liquid filled or air filled or cystic like, and also presence of calcifications in the thyroid nodule and in the thyroid gland. This becomes important because we've now developed a scoring system that says if there are sufficient numbers of these characteristics involving, again, size, shape, dimension, echogenicity, and calcifications, that we can determine whether this is an increased risk or suspicion of cancer or not. If there is an increased risk, then this prompts us to recommend what's called a needle or fine needle biopsy, which is an office procedure, which allows us to take a tiny needle and secure a tiny bit of microscopic thyroid tissue and determine the true cellular nature of that nodule, more specifically whether it's cancerous or not. It also gives us the opportunity to, by ultrasound I mean, to decide that those suspicious characteristics are minimal or not there at all, in which case the person can be simply observed over time. Sometimes that's 6 months, sometimes that's a year, sometimes that's 2 years, depending on how non-suspicious the nodules are. Well, in conclusion, I want to speak briefly about thyroid cancer. The important point about thyroid cancer is that with this ultrasound technology, we are now able to identify nodules a lot earlier in their course. And between the periods of 1975 and 2012, the incidence of thyroid cancer, particularly the most common form of thyroid cancer, that went from roughly 5% to almost 15%. Since 2012, however, that risk has plateaued. In other words, it has not continued to climb. Risk of cancer is greater in women, about 2.5 times that men. It's greater in men and women who have been exposed to radiation, either environmental or as a result of a treatment with radiation. And of course, back to the genetics, it's also increased in risk for people with a family history of thyroid cancer. There are other unproven risks that are being investigated today that have something to do with obesity or overweightedness, the presence of a previous hepatitis C infection. These are not proven, they're under investigation, so we're looking for other clues as well. The first line of treatment for thyroid cancer is surgery. Obviously, the sooner it's diagnosed, the simpler and the more likely the surgery will be curative. It can be treated in addition or supplementally with radiation. And in the last 5 years, we've had significant success with something called immunotherapy drugs as well. In summary, then today we've talked about the thyroid gland. I've mentioned its role in health in terms of controlling our overall metabolism. I've implemented its health in a number of organs and certainly in pregnancy. I've talked about thyroid in disease states and in precision. I've talked about an overactive gland, an underactive gland, a large gland, a gland with nodules, and we've also finally spoken about thyroid cancer. I've tried to make mention of the fact that the role of genetics and knowing your family history as a tool to determine relative risk for many of these conditions is extremely useful. I should also add that there are new genetic markers that are potentially identifiable in this all of us data collection and laboratory analysis that may give us even better tools to help us find out risk and earlier intervention. And again, I finally said that I am an endocrinologist and physician, but I'm also a volunteer in the All of Us program. So let me finish now or close off and say thank you for the opportunity. If there are questions, I'd be happy to hang in there. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Pitts, for your lecture, and thank you also for being a volunteer with the All of Us Research campaign. I do have a few questions that were sent over. If you have other questions, you can place them in the chat, or you can raise your hand and I can take you off of mute, or you can come off of mute. Before we do that, in the chat box currently, there is a Linktree feature that I'd like everybody to click on, go down to engagement survey. That's our way of identifying, was this helpful for you? Are there other topics you'd like to hear about? It's your opportunity to grade the program. So I'd ask everybody to please do that. The first question that was sent to me, Dr. Pitts, says, can you again elaborate on if there is a routine screening test to identify if patients have any kind of thyroid disease?
Well, yes, in my practice, most of my patients get an annual or every 2-year exam. The TSH, or thyroid stimulating hormone, is a useful tool in determining whether there is evidence of an overactive or an underactive thyroid gland. Indeed, it is the most sensitive marker for that. In terms of growth of the thyroid and nodules of the thyroid, these are picked up by physical exam, often by the primary care physician. You, of course, can alert the physician if you notice a change in your neck size, but the physical exam is the screening exam for that. Once an abnormality has been determined, the next step would be an ultrasound. But to summarize, lab tests, TSH, and an examination of the neck by your physician.
Thank you. Multiple questions about what causes the thyroid to change in size, more so get smaller.
Thyroid glands don't generally get smaller. They can get smaller if we have intervened with a toxic substance to the thyroid, either radiation, or in some cases, if it's an overactive thyroid gland, if we give drugs which limit or reduce the production of thyroid hormone, then we shrink the factory, if you will, and that will result in a smaller gland as well. In health, thyroid glands don't generally shrink. They generally stay about the same through life. In fact, they might actually slowly get larger, even without the presence of nodules. If the thyroid gland is large and uncomfortable, there is no specific and its normal functioning. There is no drug or there is no treatment to try to induce that gland to get smaller. That would end up being cosmetic surgery.
The next question says there have been commercials now recently that talk about a new drug that helps with eye problems related to thyroid disease. Can you address that particular drug, and is there actual benefit?
Yes, this is a brand new drug. It's been out about 1.5 years, maybe actually not in the market that long, but this is a drug that's used to treat the medical term, here we go, exophthalmos. This references what I spoke about earlier, where the globes, the actual eyes, not the eyelids, are actually being pushed out of their bony sockets. You think about the human skull, where the eyes sit. The walls of the eye globe are all solid. They're all skull. There's no room for the eye to go to the side or backwards. Therefore, if there's something else causing swelling, the eye is pushed forward. In Graves' disease, again, the autoimmune disease, in addition to the other effects, it actually impacts muscles that move the eyes, left, right, up, and down. Those muscles are on the side and behind the eye globe, or the eye itself. If those muscles become inflamed, then the only place for the eye globe to go is forward and out of the socket. If this is a severe circumstance, again, as I mentioned, it can interfere with your eyes being able to turn in a coordinated fashion, left to right. If they are not coordinated, that creates a double vision. It also can cause damage to the optic nerve, which is the nerve that goes from the back of the eye to the brain. In severe cases, leave the drug as Tempezi, it can actually lead to blindness. This is a brand new drug, and it has shown the ability to reduce the swelling in very, very severe circumstances, the worst circumstances. Since it is a new drug, it is thousands of dollars and it's unaffordable in terms of out of pocket. And insurance companies are ramping up to figure out what percentage of that is going to be covered. For milder conditions, The treatment for this, it has to do more with steroids or anti-inflammatory medications, and in rare cases, some radiation. Again, this would be impact not on the eye itself, but on the muscles behind and on the sides of the eye. So in summary, the new drug is available, quite costly, is reserved for the worst case exophthalmos, where the eye is dangerously being pushed out of the globe. And for milder cases, we're using steroids for the most part, and in some cases, radiation.
Thank you, sir. The next question says, for anyone that has hyperthyroidism, is there a benefit to removing the thyroid?
The treatment for hyperthyroidism can be threefold. One can be pills. Those pills are called methimazole and PTU. They've been available for 40 or 50 years. They can be used very effectively. A second would be surgery. This does involve you coming into the hospital and being operated and being put to sleep. And the third would be radiation. All three are reasonable treatments. Surgery has the ability to cure the condition. It has the disadvantage of the cost and the risk of anesthesia. It also has the risk of eventual underactive or hypothyroidism, because the concept is that we're going to remove as much gland as we need, but not all of the gland. But eventually, sometimes over a decade, this leads to permanent hypothyroidism. The same thing can be said for radiation. So it's a possibility as well, but it can also lead to hypothyroidism. Radiation takes on the average of 4 months to 6 months to work. The surgery works pretty quickly, but you have to have that patient become normal thyroid levels before you can take them to surgery, because otherwise, the simple condition of the hyperthyroidism itself is an increased surgical risk. The pills can be started immediately. They work immediately. And when they need to be adjusted up or down, they can be done. That can be done as well. Thank you.
Thank you. The next question was, you mentioned ultrasounds. Is there any problem with insurance covering that particular imaging?
The ultrasound technology is the least expensive compared to CAT scans and MRIs. It's generally very well covered. We simply need to identify the correct reason for performing the ultrasound, but it is very well covered through commercial insurances and Medicare and Medicaid as well. There's no intervention, there's no breaking of the skin, there's no pain involved, there's no risk, there's no toxic drug or drug at all being administered. So it's extremely safe, extremely affordable, and well covered.
Thank you for that. We may need some clarity on the next question. The next question says, what is your take on compounded hormones in the pharmacy?
Well, I don't use compounded hormones in the pharmacy. In terms of thyroid, there are some production factories that make thyroid hormone in a combination of both T4 and T3. Decades before, might be useful to know that thyroid hormone was not made. It was collected from the carcasses of cows and pigs to some extent, where we would actually take the thyroid gland and treat it and harvest out the hormone and then package it in capsules. In the normal thyroid gland, the gland makes, as I mentioned, T4 and T3. And so we would presume that in health, the body needs both. The body also has the ability to convert the T4 hormone to the T3 hormone, so that most people who are receiving thyroid therapy actually get T4, with the understanding that their body will take a portion of that medication and convert it to the T3. But why do we need to do that? The belief is that the T4 is to some extent a precursor hormone, and that the hormone that actually goes into the brain and into the tissues and into the nucleus of the tissues to control that level is T3. And so at some point, all T4 potentially is converted to T3. There are some people who are unable to convert T4 to T3. They would be best treated with the combination drug. Well, Dr. Pitts, why not just give everyone T3? Well, the T3 drug is got a very short half-life, and that would mean that you would need to be taking it multiple times a day, at least 2 times a day. It also means that your body would experience in an 8-hour period both a high and a low at the same in the course of up to 24 hours. So using that as a primary treatment is impractical and subjects the body to peaks and troughs that are probably not healthy. So in general, we use T4 as a principal therapy, but we can use T3 as an adjunct, as a separate pill. We can use it as a factory reproduced pill. And if there's someone compounding it, I was unaware of that, but it is available as a prepackaged pill directly from the pharmaceutical manufacturers. I hope that is useful.
Thank you, sir. The next question says, what's the familial and hereditary risk of thyroid diseases and thyroid cancer?
Well, in thyroid cancer, there are multiple causes. There are some genetic causes in which people have not only an increased risk for thyroid cancer, but they have increased risk for colon cancer, pancreatic cancer, endocrine cancers, and I think pituitary cancer as well. Those are genetics syndromes that show up in multiple generations. The principal cancer there is something called medullary cancer. The more common forms of cancer are something called papillary cancer, represents about 80 or 90% of all the cancer we have in the US. The genetics there is the cancer itself. It's often a single cancer, not associated with other cancers. As I mentioned, it's increased in women. It can start earlier in age, and the risk can continue throughout adult life. There are genetic markers, but the genetic markers we're using are actually markers that we get from thyroid biopsies or thyroid tissue itself that can increase that risk as well. Beyond that, I can't add much to it, but I do ask my patients if they're aware of any thyroid disease in their families, and of course, if they have information what the disease was, and particularly if there's cancer, and particularly if the cancer is present in one or more generations.
Thank you. What's your recommendation on patients who have hypothyroidism and supplements such as black seed oil?
No recommendation.
Okay, thank you. Is iodine supplementation only for pregnant patients?
No, there's an increased need for pregnant patients. If you are an individual who has a compromised digestive system, then you might benefit from an additional iodine as well as other B and C vitamins and vitamin D as well. So that's a case-by-case situation. If you have a normal diet and you have a normal gut, and by gut I mean the ability to absorb nutrients, and your weight is stable, then I don't presuppose that you need additional iodine. Your body can handle and secure and store iodine very effectively. And so it would take a long time to develop iodine deficiency. The pregnancy piece is just because there's a new life being formed. And it's during a critical time of organ formation that we need to absolutely be sure there's enough iodine there.
Thank you. Another question related to pregnancy. For those pregnant patients that have thyroid disease and perhaps are non-compliant with medication, is there a recommendation to curtail multiple pregnancies, or what kind of other interventions are recommended?
Well, pregnancy, number one, if you're not pregnant but you're planning a pregnancy, or you are at risk for becoming pregnant because you're having unprotected intercourse, and you would you would want to confirm that your thyroid levels are normal. If they are too low before the pregnancy starts, then you need to be supplemented, and that supplement needs to be increased probably through the second trimester. And so the women who see me get retested every 4 to 6 weeks, and I typically are increasing the amount of thyroid hormone at each visit to confirm adequacy. For too much thyroid hormone, I've mentioned that this is a high-risk situation for causing the mother to have bad health during the third trimester. It may interfere with the infant's growth during that. And so we are able to control that with medications. The goal there is to use as little medication as possible because the medication is not only going to the mother, but it's going to the infant as well. And that's a very specific discussion that's more detailed than we can do in this time segment.
Absolutely. Thank you. Last question I see is, what do you recommend for those members that have those patients that have thyroid disease in terms of checking vitamin D levels and supplementation?
Did I say vitamin D as in doctor?
Yes.
I check my patients annually. I ask them to supplement. There is not a substantial or a sufficient amount of vitamin D in the US diet. The high sources of vitamin D are in wild-caught salmon and halibut and a couple other fish, but not in farm-raised fish, and not in our vegetables, not in our soy products. And so we need to actually supplement that. And of course, vitamin D is widely available, cheaply available without prescription. The standard prescriptions in my office are about 2,000 to 3,000 international units taken daily. The amount of vitamin D in a multivitamin typically is 400 to 800 as opposed to 2,000 to 3,000. So you'd have to take a handful of multivitamins to get the same benefit. But it's a very inexpensive test to do. So when you're in your doctor's office next time, let me ask you to have that checked. And if you're D deficient, it's extremely extremely inexpensive to go ahead and supplement your diet with an over-the-counter vitamin D.
Thank you very much, Dr. Pitts. That's the last question I see in the chat. If there are other questions, just let me know. Excellent presentation, Dr. Pitts. I love no slides. I love the interactive manner. Thank you very much for answering all the questions. I'll give the audience one moment if there are any questions, but do we have any of our DREF leadership on the line? There's one last question that says, is there a preferred brand of D3?
No.
Okay, thank you. Peyton, are you on the line? So we don't have any of our DREF leadership on, so I will take the honor of saying thank you, everybody, for joining us today. Mark your calendar. Our next webinar for January, exciting, is a combined webinar on cervical health. I think our presenter is on the line today. Dr. Ray will be presenting, and it will be hosted by Chicago and also New Orleans. The New Orleans citywide coordinator is also on the line today. So I think that'll be a very exciting talk, January 27th at 6 p.m. I will send out information, and then we will talk about heart health in February. So again, if you're interested, put your email address in the chat box. And thank you all for attending. As I close out every session in the midst of the pandemic, continue to mask up, again, non-cloth. Get vaccinated if you have not. Get your booster if you've been vaccinated and have not gotten your booster, and continue to distance. Because we know, I think if we look at the numbers, that Omicron is no joke. That variant is very serious. And we're seeing significantly increased cases of COVID, even in those folks that have been vaccinated. So everybody, again, thank you very much for joining. Stay safe and have a great rest of your Saturday. And again, Dr. Pitts, thank you very much for an excellent presentation.
Thank you.
Have a great day.